Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about minority participation in World War II. And African Americans generally served in segregated military units and were assigned to non-combat roles, but demanded the right to serve in combat rather than in support roles. So they served in segregated, which means they were separate. So African Americans were not allowed to serve with white soldiers. And when it says non-combat, they usually weren't allowed to fight in the war. They were more support roles, like they cleaned, they did dishes, but they usually weren't allowed to fight. However, there was one group called the Tuskegee Airmen, which was a group of African Americans who were in the Air Force, and they served in Europe with distinction. So this is one group that did fight, and they won several awards. So that's the Tuskegee Airmen. The next group we're going to talk about is called the Nisei Regiment, and those are Japanese Americans that earned a high number of decorations. So this was the term that was given to the group of Japanese Americans that fought in World War II. And Nisei were second generation Japanese. So this means they were born in the US, but their parents were immigrants. And since they're born in the US, that makes them citizens. But their parents were immigrants. Next, there was communication codes of the Navajo were used to create a communication code that the Japanese could not break. So essentially, the Navajo is a group of Native Americans in the United States, and they had a language that the Japanese were unable to understand. And this was good for secret messages. So while we were fighting in the Pacific, if we went on the radio and we were trying to give secret messages to other Americans, they would do it in Navajo because the Japanese didn't know the language. In fact, very few people know how to speak Navajo. There's probably only a couple thousand people in the whole world that can speak Navajo. So the United States used them to send messages. There was also several Hispanic Americans who fought, and they fought in non-segregated units. So Hispanic Americans were actually allowed to fight with whites. They didn't have to be separated like African Americans. So Hispanic Americans fought in non-segregated units. In minority units, which that's African Americans, Hispanics, Japanese, Native Americans, usually suffered high casualties. And they won numerous unit citations and individual medals for bravery in action. Remember, casualties means people who were killed or injured. In fact, so I'll fix that. People who were killed or injured. Next, we're going to talk about the economic resources that went into World War II. And the United States government and industry forged a close working relationship to allocate resources effectively. And this is also called a cost-plus system. But what happened is a lot of businesses retooled from peacetime to wartime production. So a company like Ford, for instance, that makes cars, the government would go in, they would pay them, and they would tell them, you're not going to make cars anymore, now you're going to make tanks. Or if a company was making bicycles, the government would come in and say, no, now you're going to make weapons. So we started using our industry to make war supplies as opposed to things like cars or boats, things like that. And there's several other things that went on. There was something called rationing, and this was used to maintain the supply of essential products to the war effort. And all rationing means is people could only buy a little bit of something. So it could be you could only buy 2 gallons of oil. Maybe you could only buy a tiny bit of metal. Maybe you could only buy 1 pound of rice. And they did this to almost everything. And this was so the military would have enough, because soldiers need to eat food. So you have to make sure there's food for the soldiers. They need metal for weapons. So you can't have people buying all the metal. You need oil and gas for tanks, for planes, for boats. So Once again, they only let people in the United States buy so much oil. And what happened is they had this what's called a ration book. And every time you wanted to buy something, you had to give them this book. And they would take one of these rations and they would pull it. And if you didn't have the ration book, you were not allowed to buy certain products. And in order to finance the war, the United States sold bonds, and they also collected income taxes. So those were used to finance the war. But bonds are the biggest things, and bonds are something you can buy and you get paid more later. So you can go to the bank right now and buy a bond for $10, and if you wait maybe 20 years, you can get $20 for that bond. So it's just an investment, but people would buy war bonds, and the government used that money to pay for the war. And one big thing that happened with human resources is more women and minorities entered the labor force. And this was really because men started to have to leave the war to go fight in the war, so they couldn't work in the job. Like usually men would make weapons, but they were fighting the war, so a lot of women stepped up and they started working. And a lot of citizens also volunteered, and that's where they worked for free in support of the war. So a lot of people, if they had extra time, they went and they volunteered. And there was also something called the draft, or the selective service. And this was used to provide personnel for the military. And one thing with the draft is if you were selected by the draft, you had to join the military, you had to fight, you don't have a choice. The United States has only done this twice. They did it in World War II, and they did it in the Vietnam War. But if you go to college in the United States, or if you are a citizen, you have to sign up for the draft. Doesn't mean you'll be in the military, but if there's ever a war, you can be drafted if you're a male, and you have to fight if you're selected. So we're going to talk about women on the home front during World War II. And women increasingly participated in the workforce to replace men serving in the military. And women typically participated in non-combat military roles. So non-combat means they were not fighting. So women are cleaning stuff, they're building things, but they're not fighting. And there's a famous symbol of a woman, they call it Rosie the Riveter, and she became a symbol for the role of women in the workforce in the United States. She's kind of like rolling up her sleeves, she's going to go to work, and she's saying, we can do it. So she's saying, we can do exactly what men do. And we're also going to talk about African Americans. And a lot of African Americans migrated to the cities in search of jobs in war plants. So there was a lot of jobs in the United States right now, and particularly in the cities, because all of these plants that were making cars or that were industrial, they're making products for the war now, and they need people to work. All the white men went to fight in the war, so African Americans are coming in and working these jobs. And African Americans campaigned for victory in war and equality at home. So they had this double V campaign. So that means they want victory at home and abroad. So they want to win in the Pacific, they want to win in Europe, but they also want African Americans to be equal. We're going to talk about the media, communications, and collections assistance. So the United States government maintains strict censorship of reporting of the war. So this means the news could only report what the government allowed. So if there was a bombing in Europe where hundreds of Americans died, the newspaper or the television, or it wasn't really television yet, maybe a little bit, and movies, they couldn't say, oh, 200 Americans died yesterday. There was censorship. The government would say, no, you're not allowed to do that. The government said exactly what they're allowed to say. So that's called censorship, where the government prevents you from saying what you want or saying what actually happened. The other thing is public morale and ad campaigns kept Americans focused on the war effort. So advertisements, can be commercials. You see ad campaigns and could be posters. They're just things that are advertising, but the government will put a lot of ads up to try to keep Americans focused. And Americans even had collections, so people would go around and collect tin cans and aluminum foil so that they can be used in the war. And the entertainment industry provided patriotic movies, plays, and shows that boosted morale and patriotic support for the war effort, as well as portraying the enemy in stereotypical ways. So what this means is they made movies that made people proud to be American, patriotic, and it made people feel good about the war, like they're helping things. But one downside is a lot of the ways they portrayed the enemy, in particular the Japanese, were very stereotypical, which means racist. So whenever they showed Japanese, lots of times they looked like this, which I don't know if you've ever seen Japanese people. They do not look like that at all, and they try to make them seem like they're murderers and they're killers and they're evil. So it was very racist the way the entertainment industry portrayed Japanese Americans. Or not Japanese Americans, but Japanese. If you guys have any questions, let me know.